My name is Ed Bellion, and I am being assisted by Dan Pemberton as videographer. This interview is part of the Veterans History Project sponsored by the Library of Congress. We are interviewing Lieutenant Colonel Gabe Pesce, U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force retired. And please state your name and full name, date, and place of birth.
Well, my full name is Gabriel Vincent Pesce. I was born on Staten Island, which is the borough of Richmond in New York City.
And the date? And the date?
Oh, and the date, my date of birth was 21 April 1924.
Now, could you give us a little bit of information on your family background, education, and early childhood?
Yes, my family background revolves around ancestors from Italy. My mother's ancestors came from Sicily, and my father's ancestors came mainly from the small islands off the coast of Naples. My great-grandfather was born on the island of Ischia, which is famous because Lord Nelson of the British Navy had his headquarters there when he was fighting Napoleon's navy during the Napoleonic Wars. And it further has fame because he was dilly-dallying with Lady Hamilton, who was the ambassador to Naples during the time that he was there. But that has nothing. That just happens to be a connection with naval things.
And that was the dilly-dallying was Admiral Nelson, not your grandfather.
Yeah. Now, my great-grandfather was born there, but my great-grandfather came to that was my father's grandparents. Came to the United States and was raising a family. He had a big family bunch, and when his older children were old enough to be on their own, they stayed in the United States, and he went back with a couple of the youngers and his wife back to Italy, and took a job on the island of Ventotene, where he was a carpenter and not a carpenter, a contractor, and he was expert in building wharfs and piers and so forth, and he was working on the island there. And while he was there, my grandfather was born. So my grandfather then grew up there and came to the United States, but I looked very often, very hard trying to find any history with regard to his emigrating to the United States, and there isn't any because he was a citizen when he was born. And so he's not listed anywhere, and I had to do a lot of searching to find him. And an interesting thing in that search was a couple of years ago, my wife and I were on the island of Ventotene, where he was born, searching for him, and he found records of him being born there and all that sort of stuff. And I was trying to then find out something about my great-grandfather. So I went to that island, Ischia, and I went into the place to see if I could find some history on him. I walked in, and as I walked into the room, two of the people in the other end of the room, it was a big room, I was talking to the man that that I talked to first, met at the door, and they looked at each other, and they got up, and one shook hands with the other one. So I'm still talking to this fellow. So he finally asked me my name, and I told him my name is Gabe Pesce, and this is my great grandfather's name was called Vincent Pesce. So I look back, and there this one guy gets up and takes his wallet out of his pocket and gives the other guy some money. So I asked the fellow I was talking to, I said, what was happening back there? He says, well, when you came in, they had a discussion as to what your name was. And when you told me your name, this one won the bet and gave the other. I said, well, why did he ask that? He says, well, on this island, there's a village, and that village is composed of practically everybody that either has your last name or is married into some other thing. He says, and the unusual thing is that most of them look like you. So anyway, that's a little bit of a story about that. You're asking, the other background, my father's father was a shipwright. He was born on Ventotana and so forth, and he and my father, who was 16 at the time, during World War II, they had contracts with the Navy working on wooden subchasers and wooden minesweepers because of the ability. And then later, which sort of gave me a little bit of background in the Navy. I wasn't born yet then. But when I was 9 years old, my father and my grandfather told me that I couldn't be 10 years old, or nobody in my family could be 10 years old until they could skipper a little small sailboat. So they had been teaching me how to sailboat, and they took me out that day, the day before my birthday, and said, well, tomorrow, if you pass this test, tomorrow you can be 10, otherwise you're going to have to wait another year. Well, I made it that year. But anyway, they taught me how to sail. Later, in World War II, my grandfather was getting old, but the Navy asked him to do what he was doing in World War II and put a company together to go ahead and work on subchasers again and minesweepers, and also some of these amphibious landing craft. And he was getting a little bit too old, so he convinced my father to go in and take over the company. So my father had in the meantime become an opera singer, and he was busy working for Warner Brothers and other places like that. So, but he was not old enough. He was old. He was too old to be called to be inducted or drafted. He was about 38 or 40 at that particular time. So that's another that interested me in the Navy. So I was always interested. Now, in high school and everything, I read everything I could about U.S. naval history, because one of my things I wanted to do was go to Annapolis, and I tried to do that. I took the tests. I passed. I was one of the few that passed, but there were more people taking the test than there were appointments available. So I didn't get the appointment, and I went to college instead, trying to wait for that. The irony of it all is that 2 years later, when I was graduating from Brown, was going to graduate in about 2 weeks and be commissioned, I got a call from the congressman, said everybody else that I had on the list flunked out, and I have a space now to hire, to appoint somebody. You can have the appointment. So I said, no way. I went over to talk to the captain over of the ROTC unit at Brown, and I said, what do I do? Do I insult the House of Representatives guy and turn him down? Or what do I do? I said, I really don't want to start all over again. I'm going to get commissioned in 2 weeks. He says, I salute you. He says, don't. Just go ahead and do what you want to do. And I did it. So otherwise I would have. But anyway, one thing that did happen to me, that when I did get commissioned, they said I could immediately apply for a regular commission, and instead of being a reserve commission, I had a regular commission like I would have gotten had I graduated from Annapolis. Let's see, what other background? My father was an opera singer.
And
he
give us a little on the your story. You didn't go to Annapolis, but you went to Cornell. But then you were talking about Brown. So fill in that strange journey from you not going to Annapolis, but getting your commission from Brown and going to Cornell. So. Okay.
Well, what happened when I went to Cornell? It was wartime, and any able-bodied person had to be in an ROTC unit. And the ROTC unit that Cornell had was an Army ROTC unit, and they had a field. It was field artillery, and there were two troops they had there. One was regular artillery, and the other one was mounted artillery. You know, like they have the mountains and so forth. So it was in essence a cavalry unit. Well, after a couple of months of fooling around with tending to these horses and mules and so forth, I figured out I didn't really want to go to war with that. I was watching these war movies with tanks and dive bombers and so forth. I didn't want that. So the first time a Navy recruiter came on the campus, I got a hold of him and I asked him if I could enlist in the Navy. And he said, "You sure can." He looked at my record and he said, "Yeah." He says, "You fine. You know, we'll get you." He said, "But finish this semester, this year. It was the second semester of the first year, in the ROTC, and then we'll move you to a Navy unit." So the first Navy unit that he put me in was the V-12 program there at Brown, at Cornell rather. Well, after a few months of that, I had accumulated so much stuff previous to that and with that I had enough to graduate with just another 2 semesters. Only the semesters we had were short ones. They were trimesters. We had 3 equivalents of semesters in a year. So they decided that instead of having me to go through all that at Cornell and then have to go to midshipman school to get commissioned, they would send me to Brown, myself and a couple of other people, to Brown to finish up, and they would get and take the naval science courses, and at that time we would get commissioned and a degree as well. So I did that, went to Brown, and of course at Brown, when I got commissioned, I went to, they asked me, I graduated with the same class that I would have graduated with had I been in Cornell, and that was the class of '46. So now I had a degree at Brown University, the class of '46. Well, some years later, when I got out of the Navy, because I'll explain why I got out later, but when I got out of the Navy because of a sickness problem, I went back to Cornell to get a master's degree. And when I did that, they needed teachers to teach because they had a lot of students there because of the GI Bill going to school, and they needed more teachers. And here I was, already got somebody that was a graduate and so forth, and had already a degree, and I got a job as a teacher, teaching as well as a graduate student. Well, at the same time, the Air Force became an Air Force from the Army Air Corps, and the Army ROTC unit at Brown had to be split into 2 parts, the Army ROTC and the Air Corps ROTC. Well, they had no trouble keeping officers in the Army ROTC and have them also as faculty members because they had degrees and so forth. But the Air Force ROTC, the officers that had been in the Army ROTC that wanted to be in the Air Force were mostly the guys that had just gone to flight training. And they were high ranking, but they didn't have degrees, so they couldn't qualify as teachers at Cornell. So the ROTC unit didn't have any seniors because the seniors that were already Army guys stayed with the Army ROTC. So now they needed, in order to have a full curriculum there, a full class, they needed some guys that they could fill the senior class with, right? So they looked around at who was enrolled at Cornell, and they found a bunch of military guys that were either had been in the military and just going back to school and what have you. And they found one guy that had been an officer. They had others that had been sergeants and so forth. So they gave them the credits for the early part, right, and put them in the senior class. But they only had the one guy, me, that was also an officer before. So consequently, they gave me a commission and said, okay, you have the commission, but it won't be good until you finish this year and graduate with this class.
So basically, when they split the Army ROTC into Army ROTC and Air Force ROTC, they got a naval officer to take over.
They got a naval officer to be in the senior class, the head of the senior class.
And so when you graduated?
Well, the thing was, you see, I had started in that Army ROTC,
Right.
so I had that part of me, and of course I had the rest of the part was in ROTC from Brown, but it was a Navy ROTC, right? So they put me in a class there, so I took the other classes with these guys to fill up the gap, and at the end of the year they gave me the commission.
So you basically had a naval and an Air Force
Right.
commission
Right.
from what was originally the Army ROTC.
Yeah.
And and tell us about that double class thing too.
Oh, well, when I went back to Cornell and went into graduate school, they gave me credit for all of the stuff that I had done at Brown. And when they added that to what I had already done at Cornell, that qualified me for the degree that I had really started for, right? So they gave me the degree, the Bachelor of Civil Engineering degree that I would have gotten had I stayed there all the time. So they asked me what class I wanted to be connected with. So I said, well, the only class I knew was the class of 46 because it was the only one I had been with. No. So now that gave me the dubious what do you call it? Dubious
Distinction,
honor, huh?
honor, yeah.
Honor of having 2 bachelor's degrees from 2 different Ivy League schools for the same class, right? And one funny thing that happened at one of the reunions at Brown, we were sitting around the table drinking, and there was one lady there that had a few too many drinks, but not too many, but she was not feeling any pain. She said, "Really? And how did you manage to get the classes?" And one of the smart Alex in my class said, "Well, didn't you know he was on the track team?"
That's a great line. Okay, so now let's go back to Brown, and you're graduating from Brown the first time as a naval officer.
Okay, I graduated from Brown as a naval officer. Now, in my class at Brown, there was a guy by the name of Reuben Gauze. He was with me at Cornell, and he was one of the other guys that had been picked. He had been in the Navy. He was an NCO, and he had been decorated for saving some life on a merchant ship where he was stationed as armed guard crew. And during the sinking of the ship and all of that stuff, he managed to save a number of people from death, and he was rewarded by being sent to become an officer. Well, he had been on the Indianapolis before all that happened, and the Indianapolis had been damaged severely after and had been renovated, and was just going back to sea. And since it had been in the shipyard for many years, they were putting together a new crew to be on the ship. Now he was a good friend of one of the officers on the ship, the previous ship that was and who was being assigned this time, and he was making a deal for himself and several other people in our class to go to the Indianapolis because they thought that would be a good billet, because the naval war with the Japanese was just about over. We had already sunk most of the Japanese fleet, so the Indianapolis would only be used for patrolling and so forth, and maybe protecting a convoy or something of that nature. So he was trying to get us on that ship. Well, while he was doing that, a commander from Washington came in and asked for 2 people, me and another guy, a classmate of mine, and said that they want us to volunteer to go to a Japanese language class for 13 months and get completely. We weren't the only ones, though. They were finding these guys from all different colleges to do this. And the intent was to have enough people that spoke, read, and write Japanese so that as the invasion took place, they would be able to lead a crew that could go ahead and start fixing some of the things like the water department and the sewage treatment and so forth. And in order to do that, you had to be able to read and write speak Japanese, so that when you looking at a piece of machinery and you looked at the label, you knew whether it was an electric machinery or hydraulic machinery or what have you, and how to fix it and where and how to ask questions to find out where things were. So he said, "Don't do that." He says, "I'll get you on this ship." I said, "Well, I just volunteered." He says, "Well," he says, "you'll be sorry, because that invasion is going to be bad. They had just gone through the Iwo Jima, and then they were in the midst of Okinawa, and he said the casualties are going to be horrific." So I said, "Well, I can't do anything about it." He said, "You'll be sorry," and he left, and I went to the Japanese language school. While at the Japanese language school, that the Indianapolis took the bombs up to Tinian, and they dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and everybody was cheering like mad, thinking the war was over. And the Indianapolis got torpedoed. It was going by itself, and it was torpedoed, and they sent messages, but nobody was paying any attention. They were all having parties about the fact that the war was going to be over. And the ship went down, and after about 5 days swimming around in the water, 700 people had been still alive at that time, but they only about 150 or 200, something like that, finally survived because sharks got them and everything else. And the only thing that saved them was a patrol plane. The PBY was flying along, going back to Manila, and they saw all these people, all these guys hanging around in the water, and they got down low to find out, and then they sent a message in, and nearby ships came to the area and survived them. But what happened after that was they court-martialed the captain. And the captain later committed suicide, and then finally, much later, they reinvestigated the whole thing, and they promoted him to admiral post.
Yeah, and they exonerated him, basically.
Exonerated him and then promoted him to admiral. But anyway, it was a real sad place. But the thing that got me was it was kept secret for a long time. And, well, when I say a long time, it was weeks or months before anybody knew that the Annapolis had gone down and so many people had died. When we got that message, I looked at the survivors list, and there was a name R. Gauze on the list of survivors. So my roommates made it. So I then tried to find out where he was, whether he was in a hospital or what have you. And when I found out, they said, "Well, his name isn't Ron Gauze. The guy's name is Robert Gauze." I said, No. "Oh," he says, "there was another person on the board. There was an ensign, and he was Reuben Gauze went down." I said, "That was my roommate. That's the one I'm looking for." So here it was. He was trying to save me from having to go through an invasion of Japan, which was possibly a death blow. And in the meantime, he has something to do with bringing an end, really trying. I mean, the Annapolis is what caused it not to happen, because it dropped the bomb and the war ended. And I've lived with that all these years, wondering what is the God saving me for? Am I supposed to do something heroic I haven't done yet? And it seemed almost like he was so intent on preventing me from, and then he's the one that dies, huh?
So now you're out of Japanese school, basically, or it has to come to an end, but you're still in the Navy.
Yeah.
So what was the rest?
Well,
immediate post-war, maybe.
The class was made up mostly of people that were reserve officers, and they were going to get out in a few months and so forth. So they just ran the school out to the end, to the last class. Now, there were myself and a few other guys that were regulars, so we immediately started looking to see what we could do, right? So we contacted, said, "Well, what happened to us? We don't want to get discharged. We want to go." So they said, "Well, the only thing we can do is that, because we don't have to try to get an act of Congress to do it, assign you to the billets you would have been on had the war been still going. So I got assigned to two of the LSTs. A lot of them were being remodeled and equipped with more anti-aircraft guns and everything else, because of the invasion that they were going to go through, and they were scattered in various Navy yards and so forth around the country. So I got assigned to the 828, and I had trouble finding it, but I eventually found it. And then I was on it, and we were training a new crew. I went through this one little episode when I first got on the 828. It was at Mare Island, and I had trouble finding it, but I found it, and I report aboard, and as I'm getting aboard, this ensign says, I'm going ashore. And he says, you're in charge. And no, he didn't even say that. He said, I'm going ashore. And I said, fine. And I went, talked to one of the guys. They asked him where my cabin was, and he told me. And while I was opening up my sea bag to hang clothes up and everything, gangway watch comes back in, and he says, there's a commander out on deck that wants to talk to you. I said, he can't be. I just got here. He doesn't know. I don't know any commanders. And so he said, no, he says, you're the only officer on the board, and he wants to talk to you. So I go over there, and I salute smartly and say, yes, what can I do, sir? He says, you got to get this ship away from the dock. We have another one that's in dire trouble, and we have to get it to a dock before it sinks or anything else. So I said, well, I'll tell the commanding officer when he comes aboard. He said, what's the matter with you? Are you crippled? He said, get this ship away from the pier. So I ran inside and got a hold of my manual for the seaman, and I asked him to I asked the gangway watch guy to get all of the petty officers, the chiefs, the chief petty officers up on the bridge, and to show me where the bridge was so they could meet him there. So we got up there, and I explained the whole situation, and they immediately got the ship ready, and we got the thing, there was a chief motor machinist mate, a chief boatswain's mate, a chief signalman. They all got the thing ready together, and we got it away from the dock. And we're just sort of idling around there, and we're in a way. Ships are trying to come and go, we're constantly moving. So about that time, we figured, well, we'll put one of the LCVPs, one of the little landing craft, down, and we'll have it tied up someplace by the pier here. And we had a crew on it, 2 guys, and they had a radio. We kept in touch with them, and we told them to try to contact the captain, and gather the crew, and we'd just go downriver slowly, and have you catch up with us. I don't know, an hour or so later, we get farther and farther away. Finally, we get a radio message, and it's the captain. He's calling. He says, "Look, don't wait too much longer." He says, "Just call and ask for permission to tie up someplace." Right? So we did, and they offered us a buoy to tie up just off Angel Island, which is just out in the bay. So we're going slowly down the way, and then pretty soon the captain says, "Just keep going." He says, I'll wait here for the rest of the crew, and I'll take them down with the LCVP." So later that day, just before dark, we see this LCV coming with a red-headed guy waving and so forth. He pulls up, and he gets up, and he salutes. He says, "I'd like permission to get aboard my ship." So anyway, I won't tell you the rest of the story. When you buy my book that I'm making, there's a full story about what happened after that. But anyhow, it was maybe a month or two, a couple of months after that the 828 was ordered to join a bunch of the rest of the flotilla. It was about 5 or 6 LSTs. And they were going to be picking up some former German vessels and tow them out to Bikini. Some of them were going to be towed, and others were going to go in convoy with us, because they just had partial crews and they weren't all that good. And we were getting ready to do that when all of a sudden I got a message ordering me to leave the LST 828 and report to the 827. So I said, gee, what the heck did I do? You know? So the skipper said, it's not your fault. He says, the skipper of the 827 just got discharged because he was a chief petty officer, and he got a wartime promotion, which expired 6 months after the war, and it's been six months now, and he's left. So they appointed somebody else, like another officer from another ship. The only trouble is that there's a supply officer on that ship that outranks the guy that they just appointed, and he won't agree to it. He insists that he has to be in command because he's outranks him. Well, the supply officer isn't qualified to be in command of a ship. So they said, they looked around for the whole flotilla, and you're the only guy that's junior to the guy that they sent to take over that thing. And so consequently, they're going to switch you with a supply officer, all right? So anyway, as soon as I found out, I started packing like mad, but we had to leave. So we had been way up in the upper end of San Diego Bay, and they started down the thing with the intent of letting me off down at one of the piers down at like Broadway Pier, which is just at the end of Broadway. But there was so much going on, they were going to have to wait a long time until somebody moved out to get in. So I said, look, don't do that, because you're going to have to meet the flotilla out there because they're heading out across the ocean. So I talked them into letting me get off on one of the buoys. It's a big buoy out in the main harbor. It's got a bell and a whistle and a big light on it. Plus it's a yardarm with other lights. And two gulls up there. So they dropped me off my sea bag and everything. I'm on the thing and I'm watching things going on. And of course, a couple of boats went by and whistled and so forth. See this ensign of the sea bag and two gulls sitting on a buoy. Well, I signaled to one of the water taxis. They came back, picked me up, and I went in down. And then there was a question. I spent about, I don't know, 3 or 4 days trying to locate the 820s. I went up and down the coast a couple of times because he kept moving, and I'd get to the place where they had just left. But anyhow, toward the end of that year, we had just done a military exercise off San Clemente. It was a maneuver where they were practicing with new crews doing an amphibious invasion and protecting against the invasion. The Army was on the island, and the Navy and the Marine Corps were making an invasion. Well, everything was fine except the weather. We had during the whole episode, we got a big storm, and we all had to leave and get away from the shallow area. So we got out to pretty rugged seas. And all of a sudden, I just started, I slipped and fell once, and I bumped my head, and I had a big bump on the side of my back of my head here, and so forth. And after a day or so, I was just feeling terrible. Well, I lived through that, but I was still kind of dizzy and unsteady, and I kept slipping and falling. So when we got back to San Diego, the chief pharmacist mate, we didn't have a doctor, took me over to headquarters, and the doctor there looked at me and he said, we've got to take you to Balboa. They went to the hospital in Balboa, and 2 or 3 days of checking, they found that I had an infection in my ear, and I had some damage to my ear, the blow and so forth, and that it would probably take about a year or so before I'd get over that. So they took me off the ship and put me on shore duty only. Well, that was a killer, because if shore duty only, an ensign who's only been at sea for 1 year, right, even though he'd been another year or so in a Japanese language school, isn't going to get promoted when they got so many extra ensigns that they're trying to get rid of, right? So I looked around for another job. I figured since I was a civil engineer, the Seabees would be a good place to go. Well, I went there and they said, fine. If we didn't have so many people more than we're entitled to, we would consider you. But we don't know how to get rid of all of these. Now, we'll gradually be getting rid of them because some of them, their commissions will go out or they're reservists. So he said, why don't you just go back to school, get another degree, and then come back when you got the degree, you'll probably get a higher rank. So that's what I did.
That's how you got back to Cornell and wound up in the Air Force.
And that's I got back to Cornell, and that's how I happened to then get involved with that ROTC unit and the teaching and everything else, and got 2 more degrees.
Okay, so now you're in the Air Force.
Yeah.
And you're at Cornell, and eventually you get into the New York Air National Guard. How's that work?
While I was at Cornell, it was no problem keeping up my reserve requirements, to going to classes and drills and so forth. But I was working on a doctorate degree, and I needed some field experience, and I needed somewhere to do the research. And the research was on hydraulics and hydrology. So the head of my department suggested that I go to work. They were looking for guys like I was at the Tennessee Valley Authority. They had some programs that they were working on that they needed some people to continue them. So he said, I can get you a job at the Tennessee Valley Authority, and you work there for a year, take a leave of absence from your classes and so forth. So when I went down to Knoxville, it was too far to keep going to Ithaca for my reserve stuff. So there was one of these little small units that just met on weekends and so forth. So I joined that one while I was at the TVA. As a matter of fact, that was interesting. The guy that commanded that was a reserve major, but he was an active duty sergeant. And his name was Major. So
no.
we had to call him Sergeant Major and Major Sergeant. But anyhow, that lasted for about a year. So then, when that was over, I went back to Cornell. And while I was at Cornell then, I needed someplace to go. And I was trying to figure out what I would do. And about that time, one of my students was getting a job at Republic Aviation, and he had me as a reference. And the chief of the development engineering at Republic Aviation wanted to hire him, and he called me and he asked me whether I would be available during the summer vacation to work at Republic and help introduce him into the real world, because he said it looks like he's got the basics with regard to engineering, but he doesn't know too much about how to put it together. And he was much younger. Much younger. At that particular time, I was about 25 or 25 or so, and this guy was only 22. But anyhow, so I did that because I had already gotten married, and I had a child, and I needed more money than I was getting paid for as an instructor. So I took the job. It didn't sound, and I would be getting about 3 or 4 times as much money that I was getting teaching for that period of time. The only thing was that I was the only one there that knew anything about hydraulics and hydrodynamics and so forth. So at the end of the summer, I was in charge of the department, so I couldn't afford to go back. So now I'm in on Long Island, and I need someplace to go for my reserve time. So there was a member of the 106th Air Transport, which is Air National Guard unit at Floyd Bennett Field, that was there, and he suggested I go see the colonel that was in charge there. One day at lunchtime, I drove over there and saw him and talked to him. He said, "Oh boy," he said, "Yeah, we'd like you. We need a guy like you." So they immediately took me in, and I looked, and they needed somebody to be in charge of the aircraft maintenance flight. So they put me in charge of that. Well, that was all right. I worked for Republic. I knew about airplanes, and I was an engineer. And not very long after that, they needed somebody to be captain of a squadron. So they promoted me to captain, right, and gave me the air installation squadron. I had a picture of the guys there when that happened. And that was where I stayed for quite some time. And for a while, I left Republic because I was working on a research project that was connected with the Department of Defense, or actually the Department of Air Force. They were trying to develop an airplane and a system that would work with a nuclear power plant.
Really?
So to do that, they needed to develop hydraulic mechanisms that could work at high temperatures and so forth. And that was one of my specialties, hydraulic valves, right? And I had worked at Republic where I solved some of the problems that they had with the F-84s with regard to the high temperature hydraulics and so forth. So I was in that thing, and Republic and Lockheed were working together on it. And instead of one getting the whole contract, for some reason, the Department of Defense split it into two. This project would take the hydraulic one, and this one would take the pneumatic one. Well, I got selected to go to the pneumatic one, so I ended up working for Lockheed. Well, at Lockheed, that was a long distance from Floyd Bennett Field. So, fortunately, there was a squadron at Lockheed over at Marietta, where there's an Air National Guard unit, and one of those squadrons belonged to the New York wing. So when we had exercises, I would just ride with one of the guys from Lockheed that was going to Floyd Bennett for the weekend. So we used to fly back. I used to fly back and forth, and I was known as the one of the few commuting ROTC reserve guys. So, but then I got transferred to California.
Wow, and here we are.
I got transferred to California, and now I needed to find some place to record this. And it just so happened that the guy from the Air National Guard in New York said, "I just got a call asking if we had anybody."
What year are we talking about now, when you come to California?
Well, that was the year of 1961, I believe. That was when the Berlin crisis.
Oh, right, Berlin crisis.
Right. Asked if they had anybody that was going to California or something that would like to belong to the California Air National Guard. So they put me in touch with the guy that was a personnel guy, and he took me right in and signed me in and put me in the civil engineering group. And then before I knew it, we were called to active duty. And there I was for the next 2 years.
Timing is everything, especially in the military.
But and of course, in the meantime, I got promoted as a reservist. While we were on active duty, I'd gotten promoted to major. And of course, when we went off active duty, then I became a major, because while I was on active duty, I had to stay as a captain, because that's what I was when you know. That and same thing happened to Colonel Campbell, who at that time was a colonel and had was due to be promoted to brigadier general, but they went on the active duty orders came in about a week before the federal recognition came for brigadier. So he had to spend the whole active duty time as a colonel, just like I had to save the whole active duty time as a captain instead of a major.
Amazing.
Well, when I got promoted, when it was all over, then I was a major with no slot, because I was an extra major that they didn't have a slot for. So they transferred me to the Space Systems Command, which was down in where the Douglas Air Plant used to be, which is now. Well, when I was down there, I did a couple of good jobs, engineering jobs. I designed some of the alterations that they had to do to some of the buildings in order to make them suitable for the new uses that they had. And being a civil engineer that was also a licensed engineer, I was able to sign off the drawings and everything else. And then the next thing that happened, I got transferred to Europe.
By?
No, why?
No, by. Who transferred you?
Okay. I was working for ABEX, which was a company that was originally in New York and had a subsidiary now in California, which is called ABEX, and it was stationed here in Oxnard, California. You probably remember them, and I was a vice president of that company. So while I was on active duty, my assistant became the chief engineer instead of me, and they were opening up a subsidiary in Germany, and they needed somebody to head it up, so they sent me to Germany to get that started, right? So I was in Wiesbaden now, and that's a long way to try to commute to California. So they transferred me to UCOM headquarters. Well, first they had to transfer me to USAFE because I was I was an Air Force officer, so that was where my headquarters was. So USAFE then gave me a mobilization assignment at UCOM. In other words, in case of a war, I would have to be called to UCOM, and I was the understudy for a member in the logistics officer in J4. J4 had several officers there. There was a Marine, a Navy, an Air Force, and an Army guy, right? I was the understudy for the Air Force guy, right? And in case of war, what would happen is the understudies would get promoted, and they would split the thing between them. So half of the understudies and half of the thing would form one unit, half of the other unit. So my first assignment there was at UCOM when it was still in Paris, right? And then de Gaulle got in there, and he didn't like us, so he decided to get rid of the U.S. from France, and we got chased out. And we got transferred then to Vaihingen, which is a suburb of Stuttgart in Germany. And then each time I had to put in extra time and so forth, or each time they needed me, I had what they called vest pocket orders. During the Cold War, guys in Europe had that. You had this vest pocket office, and they could call you and tell you that they needed you at such and such a time, such and such a place. Or they could ask you where you were, and if you were in a place where they would like to get some information, they would say, you could be on active duty for so many hours and days, go ahead and do this. So I would manage to be able to do that between time, because I was a vice president, I made my own time. When that happened, I could rearrange my schedule so I could be off for a couple of hours to do whatever they wanted me to do. So I spent 8 years doing 7 years it was there, 7 years doing those sorts of chores. For example, and of course, my company would allow me to take 2 weeks steady in one time every once in a while, and I just could arrange that to when they needed me. I did a lot of stuff. For example, one time they had a jiffy job with nobody to do it, and that was to investigate all of the buildings over at USAFE and pick out those places that could be diverted to fallout shelters, right? And they needed a civil engineer that knew what he was doing to survey all of this and so forth. And in 2 weeks, I did the whole thing, and because well, they gave me guys to help me.
Yeah.
But we surveyed it all. We dredged it out. We did the whole thing. We inspected them and so forth, and I had guys measuring them and telling them, and then we sat down and we figured them out, and then I wrote a report and we did the whole thing, and then later they actually did the physical fixing of it. But on paper I figured out the whole thing. Another time they had their laundry kept exploding on them. The water mains and so forth, the hot water pipe would split and everything else, and they couldn't figure it out. And so I went over and had them. I looked over, studied it, made some calculations, and I found out that they were trying to overdo it with the pressures and the heat temperatures they had. So I changed that schedule a little bit, and it fixed it. But the most important one involved a little bit of spookiness. The secretary I had was a Finnish girl. She was from Finland, but she spoke Finnish, she spoke Swedish, she spoke all of the Scandinavian language, she spoke German, and English was pretty good. And she had worked for SAS, the airline, and she wanted to move to Germany where she could be in more contact with English-speaking people, Americans especially. And I had a secretary that was German that was trying to get rid of a boyfriend and who had lived in Sweden during the war because her parents had sent her there because they lived in a place to get her away from. So she had friends in Sweden. And she wanted to get back to Sweden and away from this boyfriend that she didn't want. So she asked me if I knew anybody in Sweden that might need a secretary. And in the meantime, I said, yes, yeah, I do. I know the guy that's in head of programming and everything for SAS. So the next trip I went there, I asked him if he needed a secretary. I asked him if he needed a secretary, and he said, yeah, I was going to call you and see if you needed one. So we swapped secretaries. Well, it turned out that the Finnish girl got involved with one of the Air Force intelligence officers. And she, of course, now was my secretary, right? And that intelligence officer and she would come and visit us and so forth. And sometimes we go out to lunch and so forth. And he became aware of the fact that I traveled a lot because we had contacts with the military and airline facilities practically all over the world, including the Near East and Africa and everything else. And they were also interested in the fact that I had a contract with the airline in Egypt, for spare parts and so forth, and also one in Ethiopia with the Haile Selassie and so forth. And Haile Selassie had problems paying us for stuff. So sometimes he would charge that off by giving me free flights on his airplane to get to various places. In other words, if he owed us, we given us credits on that. So this guy thought this was great because they couldn't get anybody in to really see things in Cairo. And of course, by going to Addis Ababa, the plane had to stop in Cairo because the altitude in Addis Ababa was such that they couldn't fly with a full load and go non-stop all the way to Europe from Addis Ababa. So one of the first stops coming and going was always at Cairo, and there's always a fuel change, and it'd take a while. So he says, Gabe, every time you do that, can you look at a few things for us? Right? So I said, yeah, what do you want to look? I can do that. And what they were having a look at was the fact that NASA, who was the president there at the time, was trying to make a safe haven for his Air Force, right? So they were building these air shelters so that the airplanes would be sheltered in there and would be protected from any possible preemptive attack from Israel. So anyway, and my job was to keep track of how the thing was going, when they might be finished, and how long it was going to take, and so forth. So I was at least once a month on there, walking, going back and forth, back and forth. Finally, it got to the point where it was pretty near the end that I was going to have to come up with some estimate as to. Now, I wasn't the only one working on it. There was plenty of other guys doing the same things, but they were trying to get a consensus of what it was. But my knowledge of construction and how long it takes to move so much dirt and so forth was sort of an important thing in that. Now, one of the things that was interesting here is the fact that my wife kept egging me, saying, look, she says, the Officers' Wives Club, because we belong to the Officers' Wives Club at the base, in Wiesbaden, they're having a tour of the Holy Lands, and I'd like to go on it. And then it's going to go to Cairo and Jordan, and all those places. I says, well, I can't go right now because I'm busy doing other things. And it was periodically going on. I said, when is the next one? And she said, well, it was in May sometime, early May. And I said, I can't go on that one, but thinking a little bit, and my calculations were that the aircraft shelters would probably be getting finished early in June. So I said, when is it? She said, well, just the first week in May. I said, well, why don't you go? I can't go. You just go with the club there and so forth. So she went with the club and so forth. When she came back, I asked her what happened, and now she came back. Now this was like mid-May by that time.
And what year do you think that is?
1967. She came back, and of course that's the year when the Paris has their air show and all that sort of stuff. So she came back, and I asked her what she saw when she was in Cairo, because she went down. They stayed a day or two in Cairo. She said, "Oh, there's so much activity going on there in Cairo." They said, "There's airplanes all over the field, and there's guys working and hammering and everything else." So I asked him. I said, "Do they have did anything that looked like piles of dirt and stuff on either side and a roof?" And well, they said some of them have roofs on it and some of them don't, and so forth. Okay. So anyway, we go to we go to she had some of them had pictures. I looked at some of the pictures that they took, and I called my friend there and I told him what the situation was, and I think I said my guess early June was probably going to be what's happened. So anyway, the company that I was vice president of had a cabana at at the parasail show, and we were entertaining some guests, and there was a TV set over there with the daily news going on. All of a sudden, a news flash. The 6-day war had started. The aircraft and the Israelis wiped out the Egyptian Air Force right on the field about a day or two before they finished the shelters. Well, we're sitting there, and that flash comes on, and my wife looks at me, and she said, "You knew, and you let me go on that trip?" I said, "Since it was going to be in May, I knew nothing was going to be happening, and this might be the last chance you got to see there if the things didn't work out right."
Wow. So you were really a spy for...
Well,
or an information.
You call me that.
Yeah.
I was an indirect spy. She did the spying for me. I had been previously keeping track of what was going on.
Very interesting. It sounds like something out of one of those Cold War novels.
Okay, what's next?
So let's see. Well, so now you're working there in Europe. You're a reservist. You're a company man, and you had some other jobs in Europe that they came to get you. You were there for...
I was there for 7 years. Yeah.
And then what happened? Did you come back to the United States?
I did lots of jobs. One other one where my Japanese language got handy. One day, one of the staff officers from the commanding general at USAFE gave me a call, and he says, "Colonel Smothers here, your buddy, says that you speak Japanese. You know Japanese." I said, "Yeah, I went to Navy Japanese language school and so forth." He says, "Good, we need somebody. The general wants to talk to you. You got some time free?" So I said, "Yeah, when do you want to see me?" He says, "Any time that's available for you. We know you're busy being vice president of the company there." He says, "How about meeting us over at the officers club after work?" So I went over there.
This is at Wiesbaden?
Huh?
We're at Wiesbaden?
Wiesbaden, yeah. And he sits down, he says, "Look," he says, "we have a contingent of Japanese people coming from Japan, and they want to inspect the various companies that are in NATO because they want to adjust their status of forces agreements the same as the ones that you have over here, to see if there's any difference, see if there's any better making them change." So they want to. The Air Force has been appointed as the agency to escort them around to each of the countries, and so they can look at their status of forces agreements. He says, "Now, when they're here, I have to introduce them." This is the general saying. He says, "I have to introduce them, and I have a welcoming speech to make. It's the same speech I give to everybody, but it's got to be done." He says, "Now, they tell me that most of these guys don't speak English too well. They understand a little bit, but they don't speak it too well. So it would be nice if I had somebody that could translate my English into Japanese while I'm talking." He says, "Do you think you could do that?" I said, "Well, it depends on how complicated your speech is." "Oh," he says, "we have plenty of time. We got about a month or so." He says, "I have this all typed up. It's a canned speak. I'll give it to you. You can look it over and see if you could do it. It's okay." So I took the thing and I read the thing over. It's a pretty long speech. And I looked up words that I didn't know, and I said, "Yes, I can do it. I've got it all done." He says, "Well, if you could do that," he says, "it's summertime, and it's going to get hot in that war room with all these people sitting around there." And he says, "Do you think you could just give the speech in Japanese?" I said, "Colonel," I said, "General," I said, "that's a little different than translating while you're..." He said, "That's all right." He said, "You can read it if you like, write it out and read it." I said, "Okay, I can try that." And he said, "Of course, there may be some questions after you're finished." He says, "If you could field those questions and then repeat them in English to us, we'll answer them for him." Okay, fine. So the time comes, and I get up there and I give the speech in Japanese, right? And of course, what would have been a long-winded speech, I sort of shortened it a little bit by not going to a little bit. So finally, I get to the end, and the guy they're asking questions, and I answer. I take the question, translate it into English, and somebody in the crew, one of the generals or colonels, answers the question, and I translate it to Japanese. And I did that about 2 or 3 times, and finally, the guy asks a question, and I don't know what he's saying. I mean, I can't. So we're talking back and forth in Japanese for him trying to explain what it is that he really is asking. And one of the generals gets up and says, "Would I please get somebody to tell me what in hell is going on?" So I explained to him. I said, "Look, he's trying to ask me something that I don't understand, and we're trying to some of the other fellows are trying to help him explain it a little bit more clearly." So they finally did that and everything and so forth. But anyway, I got to be sort of the guy, the know-it-all guy that suddenly came out from nowhere to give a speech in Japanese.
And this, of course, you really hadn't spoken Japanese in a long time.
A long time, yeah.
Well, better you than the rest of us. So now, how long did
but I had spoken Japanese on and off after that, too, because the guy that was head of that bunch of crew, I escorted him around to some of the other places because he asked if they do that, and he arranged it, his schedule, so that it didn't interfere with my other business schedule. But then he invited me to Japan. He says, whenever you're coming to Japan, let me know, and then call me. He says, I'd like to show you around. You showed us around here. I'll show you around Japan. So I went and visited him a couple of times, and one time, he and his wife took me to a movie theater. And they had, between the movies, stage act, and they had this guy leading the singing, just like they had the words on the screen, and everybody sings in accordance to the one. So they got this thing going, and the song is up there, and it's in Japanese, and they got the little dot bouncing on the thing and so forth. And I like to sing, and I got a loud voice, and I was singing real loud. And all of a sudden, the guy that's leading this looks at me, because we're down in about the 3rd row, looks at me, and when the music stopped, he points to me, and in Japanese, he says, "How come you're speaking Japanese?" And I says, "Well, it's fine. I'd learned Japanese." He says, "Well, how come you're singing the right words?" I said, "Well, because I can read." He said, "But it's in Japanese." I said, "Well, I can read Japanese." So finally, I start talking to him in Japanese, and the audience is now turning and looking at me.
You never know when those 12 degrees will come into to use somewhere.
Well, they've come in use other times too, Japanese. One time I was in Paris, not in Paris, in Switzerland. I was in Geneva, and I was trying to catch an airplane back to Wiesbaden, and it was a weather problem, and there was delays, and it was a big long line waiting to talk to the thing. And in front of me there was a Japanese family, a man, a woman, and their young boy. A young boy about 10 or 12 years old. So anyway, there's the boy, the girl, the woman, and then me, and they're talking about, and of course the loudspeaker is speaking in all languages in Europe, except Japanese, right? So finally, they're talking amongst themselves, saying, "Gee, what does it say?" And the husband tells her, "I didn't understand that." So he turns around and looks at me, and I said, "Sir," in Japanese, and I said, "If you don't understand that, this is what he's saying, all right?" And he said, "Oh, good." Yeah. And his wife turns around, she says, who are you talking to? And she turns to me and says, "Talking to him." And she turns to me and she asks me what I said, and I said, "Explain." She turns around, grabs the little son. She turns around. She says, listen to him, all right? You're Japanese and you can't speak that way, and look at how he can speak Japanese.
Yeah, well, yeah, so.
But anyway, that happens.
So, finishing your military career, you're in Germany, and then I know you come back to the States, right?
Yes.
And then you get recalled back to Europe.
No, well, that was a long time later. When I came back to the States, the first thing that happened, they wanted to transfer me from UCOM, which is European, to Korea, because they needed a reserve officer, an engineer, and so forth. So they assigned me to there, but I really didn't fit there because I didn't speak Korean or anything. So consequently, about that time, they needed a civil engineer at Vandenberg Air Force Base. So they said, we have an unusual assignment here. You assign you as a mobilization assignee there, and we'll give you orders just like you had in Europe, whereby when we need you, we'll call you and you could just come in. So I had that situation there where I was the deputy civil engineer at the base, and I put in maybe 4 or 5 days a month, like 1 day a week or something like that, where I'd go there, stop there, and it was close to where I had an office. I had an office in Buellton. I'd go there and I'd look at all of their new drawings. They need somebody that was a licensed civil engineer that could sign the drawings for California to get the permission. So I used to review the drawings and everything else, and then sign it and stamp it and so forth. And I did that for about 1.5 years, and then my time was up and I retired.
And what year did you retire?
That was 1974.
So roughly from 46 to 70.
Yeah, that was when I was about 50 years old, right?
So now you're retired.
Now
That's the end of your military. You're not going to do anything more with the military.
Well, what I did then is I joined the Coast Guard Auxiliary.
Of course.
And I still belong to the Coast Guard Auxiliary. And I did a lot. I was a flotilla commander in the base and so forth. But that's separate. What happened again, and this was in 1995, right?
So you'd been retired 21 years.
At this particular point, I retired. I was completely retired from the Air Force. I closed down my engineering practice. It was all closed. I sold my company and everything, and I was on my boat. It was a 50-foot island trader motor sailor, and it was a Sunday morning. My wife and I were lying on this big bed in the cabin, and we're reading the newspaper, the morning Sunday newspaper, and the phone rings. You know, we got one of the portable big phones that looked like a big shoebox with a phone on. And it happens to me, a friend of mine who was a retired colonel, and I've got a picture of him in here. And he said, Gabe, he says, you remember? And he was a guy that I knew back then. He was one of the principals when I was an understudy at UCOM, see? So he says, remember all the places we went in Spain and everything? Didn't you like it there? I said, yep. He says, well, I got a place for you right now in Spain. He says, all you have to do is come down here. It's down near Seville, and we need an engineer to start a project for us to renovate a base that's been in mothballs for 20 or 30 years. My wife was listening. She grabs the phone. She says, we'll be there. She liked Spain. So okay. So I says, what? I said, you know, I can't really go right now. I said, right now I just have a contract with the air base, the naval base here. They hired me to do a project in Alaska. They needed somebody that put a project together to survey the pipelines from the Air Force base and the tank farms and so forth. And I said, I'm committed to go ahead and finish that project. And I started it But now what happens is that we have to go back and make some changes to the pipeline and inspect it and so forth, and I have to write a report. So I won't be able to come out there until about April 1st, end of March or April. And this, right now, I'm talking to him, it's January, right? And I had started part of this project in December, and I found all these things that needed to be done, and I had to get the Corps of Engineers to make those changes, and then I had to go back and do the inspection. So I did that. And then in 1995, I went to Spain. When I went to Spain, it turned up that the job was a lot bigger than they anticipated, because when we went through the requirements for the airplanes of different weights and so forth, they had to make major changes to the runway. And since nothing had been done to maintain the hangars and everything except paint them and cut the grass, practically all the hangars had to be remodeled. All the wastewater treatment plant had been not used for a long time and needed to be completely overhauled. The water treatment plant is almost non-existent, right? And with all the new EPA rules for water supply and everything, that had to be all renovated. The housing, you know, the family housing was in terrible shape and no longer met the basic requirements for the amount of housing for the family, so I had to redo all of those. So there was a lot of work. So my job entailed hiring Spanish guys and some Americans who were living in Spain and make an engineering crew out of them that know how to design and build stuff and supervise the construction. So it took 8 years to get it all done.
And how long did they initially, how long did they think it was going to take originally?
Well, originally, they figured it was going to be 18 months for me to get it started.
Oh.
Well, I got it started in 18 months, but now they needed to find somebody to supervise it. So the rule on the contract was that they could extend me for 2 years at a time, except that they couldn't extend me beyond my 80th year. So when I was 79, they wanted to extend me, and they couldn't go 2 years unless they got me to waive the situation. So my wife decided, well, we've been here long enough now. Let's go home.
So she was tired of Spain after.
No, well, wait a minute. So then I came back home, and a year later, well, first of all, before a year was up, I came home, and a month or so later, they called me. They said, we still haven't found anybody. Can you come back and just hold the fort and keep things going for a month at a time until we find somebody? So they kept me there for a couple of months. And then I came back home again, and they said, can you do something for us? Now, this was the Air Force directly, had nothing to do with where I was there, but the Air Force in the United States, they had another air base in California at Beale Air Force Base, and they had a water treatment plant there that somebody wanted to completely redo, a tremendous amount of money. They said, we need another opinion. Can it be done cheaper? So they hired me back for I don't know, I don't remember how many days. They gave me so many days to go ahead and take a look at it and come up with a report as to what I did. I wrote the report and submitted it, and they changed their whole outlook, and they opted to a much cheaper way of doing the change. And that was the last thing I did for the Air Force.
So what was the base in Spain? Was it Morón?
Yeah, Morón Air Base.
And they use that it's been used as a tanker base now since then.
Which?
That's what it became, a tanker base for Desert Storm. I know they used it, and probably for.
Yeah, well, I was all there during
Yeah, 92,
David Stone.
91,
Yeah.
92?
No, I wasn't there in 92. I started being there in 95.
Okay, so,
But I was there with after the.
oh, it was '02. It was when was Desert
No,
Storm?
there were the things happening over in Serbia and
Oh,
Bosnia.
91. Okay, so it was Bosnia.
Right.
But I remember there was a tanker.
And also there was the big trouble in Africa during Clinton's administration. Yeah.
Oh, so that basically brings you up to, you're out of the service and now you're just really retired.
Yep. I'm really retired, and that brings us up to about 2002 or 2003.
So
Let's see, what else did I have? Yeah.
well, let's see. We could. I mean, can you tell us about your life after retiring? But obviously, after retiring and reflections on your service in the military.
Well, I did a lot of reflecting on it. So, for example, I originally wanted to have a career as a naval officer and go the way. Of course, I got stymied on that along the way because of that ear problem. And I was torn at that particular time as to just should I go ahead and take the Navy, the Air Force commission and do that, and go for active duty there, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to maybe go out to sea. And of course, we don't have seaplane. The Air Force doesn't have any ships, so. Well, my family was growing about that time, and of course that was becoming a much more important factor. And so Air Force started to look okay because I could have a little bit of both. I could be a fairly active reservist and hop around like the various things that I did, and at the same time I could have a civilian life and so forth. Unfortunately, the civilian life was just as busy and just as varied as the other life was, so that between the two, I was kept busy with a variety of things. As a matter of fact, I one time joked about the fact that when somebody asked me, why did I do so many different things? And I says, well, somebody once told me that variety was the spice of life. And thinking about it, I like things very well seasoned. So, so I figured that's one way of satisfying the variety.
Well, you certainly didn't have a predictable path. I mean, you.
No, well, and there's lots of things that I haven't even told you in this short period of time. There's one interesting situation. At the Japanese language school, there was one officer there that was a British naval officer, and he was assigned to the school by them, and his name was Pierce, P-E-A-R-C-E, all right, and my name is pretty close. And of course, in those days, everything in the military was done according to alphabet, right? So whenever we had pay call or whenever we had anything that assigned seats or something like that, he would either be sitting in front of me, beside me, or be back of me, or someplace like that. Well, and he wore a beard because he had been assigned up in Alaska someplace where it was cold, and he grew a beard, and he had an ID card with a picture with a beard on it. Well, now we're in Colorado. You know, the University of Colorado is where the beginning of that school was, and he couldn't get a new ID card because no British naval facility in Colorado, so he had to have that beard all the time. Well, anyway, many years later, I'm in Kenya, and I was in Nairobi. And in Nairobi, the Kenya had already taken over and become a country, and Jomo Kenyatta was the president and so forth. And a lot of the Kenyans now the blacks had jobs, important jobs, and they thought the important thing for a man that was in charge of something would have to wear a white shirt and a tie and so forth. The only problem was that they wore white shirts, and they got dirty, right? So they bought 6 or 7 shirts, and one dirty every day, and then they'd take them home and their wife would take them out to the creek and go barge them on the rocks and clean them up and so forth. So those shirts would last, 2 or 3 washings, and they were done. So I'm sitting there talking to this guy at the Stanley Hotel, having breakfast, and I'm explaining, asking him what he does for there. He says, well, I work for, what is it, Irish? No, what's the ones that make white men's shirts, the company that, the big
Van
famous,
Heusen?
One of those shirts.
Yeah.
I don't remember which company it was. I says, you wear white shirts here in Kenya? Oh, he says, yes. And he was telling me the story about how they wash them and so forth. And he says, I don't even have to leave my place. I live here at the Stanley. I eat dinner here and so forth, and do whatever I feel like. And they just come over and order. And I want 6 shirts. This guy wants 6 shirts. This guy wants 6 shirts. They order them just like clockwork every month. I get it. Well, anyway, while we're sitting there talking, I said, well, what is there to do here in Nairobi? Because everybody left, on Friday afternoon, and they wouldn't be back until Tuesday morning or something like that. So what am I do? He said, well, the thing for you to do is just to go down to Mombasa. That's on the seacoast. He said, that's an interesting place. Go down there, and there's a nice hotel. There's also not nearby. There's a British military R&R place. It's a nice place, and that's over at Malindi, which is right next to Mombasa. So he says, if you hurry down to the airport, you probably can catch an airplane down. They leave at such and such time. So I rushed down to the airport, and here's one of those Fokker high-wing prop jet airplanes. And I got the last seat. I rush in there. I sit down and the guy sitting next to me is a British naval officer. And I was talking to him and talking to him, a little bit, and I'm telling him this is my first time. I haven't been to Mombasa before. Maybe tell me a little bit about it. He looks at me. He says, haven't I seen you someplace before? I says, what do you mean? He says, I don't know. I says, there's only one British naval officer that I know, ever knew, and his name was Pierce. He says, that's right, and you're Gabe Pesce.
Wow, now that's a small world. Holy cow.
Right. So what he was in charge of the little navy, the little navy in at Kenya.
Okay.
And
Go ahead.
And he said, we're having a review of my ships tomorrow. He says, where are you staying? He says, well, you'll get a hotel room, and I'll tell you where it is when we get there. My office is in that hotel. He says, I'm in charge of that Navy, and we have a few ships, and Jomo Kenyatta is going to be there, and they're going to have a little ceremony and blessing the new ships that they have. So he invites me to the ceremony, invites me to Jomo Kenyatta, and I'm sitting there amongst them while the ships go by. And Jomo Kenyatta says to him, he says, bring the ships a little closer so that we get a better look at them. So he looks at me. He says, you want to try to explain to him why we can't bring those ships a little bit closer? So I said, no, you better do it by yourself.
So were they still British ships, or were they the Kenyan ships?
Like corvettes,
But I mean, were they the British Navy, or was it the Kenyan Navy?
No, there's the Kenyan Navy. They were trying to develop a little Kenyan Navy, mostly pretty much like a big, oversized Coast Guard.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the thing is, in this particular harbor there, at low tide, you could probably walk out to about a mile or so at high tide. If he took too long, he would have to stay there for the next tide. Right?
So now on all of this, tell us a little bit about your family, and then we'll wrap it up here. We got about 10 minutes left, or 8 minutes left on the...
Well, my family is a long one. I have a son who was born in 1951, and he's a very active teacher at a high school in Bremerton, Vermont. He lives in Williamstown, just across the border from Bremerton there. And he has 2 sons and a daughter. One son is a doctor of physical therapy. The other son is a captain in the Marines, and the daughter is another school teacher. His wife is a school counselor. I had a daughter that was murdered. While she was in college, and a very famous serial killer that killed a whole bunch of people, including her, and that was when she was 19 years old. The next child was a son, and he's an engineer. He lives in Ventura, and currently is working for a company that is associated with the gas company. The next daughter I have is she graduated as a biologist and had been working for a while as with a doctor who was doing experimental work and so forth. And she had a roommate who was one of her sorority sisters who was working in a restaurant. And they were living together in Tacoma, where she went to school. And she found that roommate wanted to go home for Christmas, and it was going to take a little while to be off. And she wasn't going to come home for Christmas because we were going someplace else. So that was times when I was getting around the world. So she substituted for her. She found out that she could earn in about 2 days working in the restaurant as much as she would get in a month working as a research biologist. So she changed place. She came back and to Los Angeles, where my younger daughter was going to school, just starting at UCLA. So they roomed together, and she took courses also about running restaurants and all that sort of stuff. And she got a job working for a restaurant, and the next thing you knew, she was managing the restaurant. And then she got hired by Wolfgang Puck as a designer to design restaurants and menus and so forth. And then Wolfgang Puck had her going all various parts of the world, starting new companies and so forth. So she gave up on that. She said, "This is too much. I can't stand it." So she took a couple of years off and just started traveling around the world and writing, taking pictures with a camera and making little books, tourist type books. Okay, and that's her. And then she still does that. She quits every so often and does this, and then while she's not doing anything, somebody calls her and says, "I got a restaurant I want you to start, or I want you to run." So she's running 2 restaurants right now down in one in Culver City. My youngest daughter married a Canadian architect, and then she moved to Canada, and they live in Toronto, where where she has a business. She's a fashion designer. She designs women and men's clothing, and she then makes trial runs and then sells the designs to people and so forth.
Gee.
And she has a daughter that is been visiting us now. She just graduated from college in Nova Scotia in Halifax, and she's a marine biologist, and she's thinking about going to school either down at the University of California in La Jolla or in Santa Barbara. She's more inclined to want to go to the Santa Barbara one. So if that works out, she'll be with us for a couple of years while she gets a master's degree.
Gee.
My wife, of course, is a retired nurse practitioner, and she and I have been around the world in various places for a long time. We've dragged our children all around to these places and so forth. I feel that I owe the United States and my country quite a bit for really all it's done for me. It gave me the opportunity to get educated over and over again, gave me the opportunity by virtue of learning a whole bunch of languages to understand what people do and what they're like in various parts of the world, and it got me to believe that all people are about the same. They feel cold when it's cold out, they feel hot when it's hot out, they get hungry when they haven't eaten, and so forth. It's just, you have to be able to understand their little idiosyncrasies and so forth, and you have to make sure that you don't try to expect more from them than they're really capable of, and you also don't want to belittle them if they are capable of more. As I said, variety is the spice of life. Mine is very, very well seasoned.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it here with the time, Gabe. This interview will be archived in the American Folklore Center in Washington, D.C., and the 146th Alumni Association Heritage Room. Gabe, thank you for your participation in the Veterans History Project, and thank you for your incredible service to our country and the path that you took, as varied as it may have been. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you.